Hello, everybody, and welcome to Asha USA's 2022 Speaker Series, Take Charge of Your Life. As you know, Asha USA is a nonprofit organization with a mission to create health and happiness in the South Asian community in Minnesota. Today's topic has to do with all of us, whether you are a child, a teenager, a young adult, a middle-aged, or older person. We all age. That is something that we cannot control. What we can do is learn how to age gracefully and take care of things that we need to at each step of our life. Whether it is our body, our mind, our finances, our relationships, and so many other things. So today we have with us Amy Miller from Our Family Encounters. Hello, Amy.
Hello, thank you so much for inviting me to join you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. Amy has been a mediator for community and businesses, and recently she founded Our Family Encounters, and she has authored 2 books. Her first book is called Last Life Lesson, a guide for aging adults and families. And her second book, which came out very recently, is called Aging in Place Conversations. So we welcome you to today's session, Amy. Can you tell us a little bit about the work you do?
Absolutely. So I came into this conversation, this topic, actually quite by accident. I don't know if people were here in 2019 when we had that really cold winter. I think we had that first shutdown for about a week. Well, I had brain freeze that day and I ended up going to the wrong meeting. And at that meeting, I ended up meeting some healthcare professionals. And when I shared I was a mediator, they said, actually, I think you might be able to help us out. First of all, doctors rarely say they need help from others, right? So I'm like, oh, really? And what they shared with me were 2 things that they're seeing in their day-to-day work at the hospital or in their practices. The first one is healthcare directives. So if you go to the emergency room and you do not have a healthcare directive, the hospital has to decide what happens. They have a protocol they have to follow. And I think many people may be realizing that protocol may not be respectful of what your wishes really are, but they don't have a choice. They don't have an alternative to use. And then the second is they've been seeing more and more people come to their clinics alone, which is an indication that people are maybe not in community or people are aging on their own. So it opens up a whole conversation that I've been working on for pretty much the past 4 years to go, okay, what is the situation? Where are some of the gaps? Where can we fill in and find some solutions for these and come up with a way that we can educate, which is one of the reasons why I've written my 2 books, The Last Life Lesson, and then being able to partner actually with 20 other professionals in the elder care space, which is actually the second book that just came out, which is from National Aging in Place Council. It's a book that they've compiled and brought 20 people together from around the country to have a conversation, asking a lot of the questions and having us provide the answers on how to do everything from housing, legal, finances, transportation, and I think staying social, staying active in the community. Mm-hmm. So these are 2 great books that are available. My book, Last Life Lesson, is available on my website, which is ourfamilyencounter.com. But the Aging in Place Conversations is available now on Amazon.
Yeah, so before we talk about that, I would like to start by saying that, as you know, we come from a collectivist cultures, South Asian Americans. And we come here to America, which is an individualistic culture. Mm-hmm. And we really don't know what it means to grow up or grow old in America. So if we think of that, whether it's young kids, teenagers, young adults, or older adults, what are some of the things that we need to know about? What are some of the rights that people need to be aware about?
Absolutely. And this is this is a great thing to, I think, difference between the cultures and Americans. Americans do have that very individualistic idea. So it's not assumed that the family or the community will have the answer. So going back to, and we'll go through this timeline here, going back to that healthcare directive. Probably the most important right as Americans that we see that we have is that we can assign to somebody else to speak on our behalf if we cannot speak for ourselves. Now, we have that separated into two decisions. The first one is our legal and our financial decisions, and then the second one is our healthcare decisions. So they can be the same person or they can be two completely different people. But being able to authorize someone else to speak for you is a right that is very American, I think. But it's one that maybe isn't communicated as well as it should be.
Yeah. So let's first look at the timeline that you have made here. And can you talk a little bit about it?
Oh, absolutely. So it actually starts at birth. And when we have a little baby, we go, okay, what are the things that we need to think about for our children? Being a parent, there's a third decision that you have to make besides who can speak for you on your health and your finances, is who could be your guardian for your child. So I'm going to start with choosing a guardian, and then I'll go into the questions or the comments about life insurance, and then should I have a will or a trust? When you choose who can be a guardian, obviously we expect to be able to parent our lives for our child's life, right? At least until they're 18 and can go out on their own. But that's not always how life works. So deciding who can take on the care of your children is a very important decision that needs to be made by parents. I believe in many cultures, it's automatically assumed it would go to the grandparents or a sibling or
an uncle and aunt, yeah.
Or an aunt or an uncle. Yeah. But this is where we actually, that is still the assumption. It's called intestate. So you'd have to go to the courts, and the courts would have to assign who that person is. But if you want to avoid that time and that expense of going to probate, if you put in your will or your trust, if something happens, this is who, and you specifically list who will have that authorized responsibility. And then the other thing going then into will or trust, really a will is your last will and testament. The whole point of a will is to assign who would be a guardian for your children, who would inherit your goods and property, and then ultimately assign someone to close out your estate. Those are really the primary purposes of a will. A trust is something where if you want to create what I call like a legal vehicle, and this is something with the assistance of attorneys, which just to confirm, I'm a mediator, I'm not an attorney, so I would say contact an attorney for guidance on creating this. Typically, if you have more assets, a trust makes sense because then you can just transfer those assets after everything goes through probate directly to your heirs or whoever you'd like to receive your life's work. So those are the two estate planning tools that are created. And then life insurance, typically with a child, very reasonable. But the idea of life insurance, there's two kinds of life insurance. One is what's called term. Usually you hear about that at your job, that you can get life insurance from your job. Term policies are there to care for your family in case something happens to you. It can pay off your house. It can provide the finances to your spouse so they can cover those expenses of raising your family and for themselves. The other kind is called a whole life policy, which is basically a cash investment type of policy. And that's one that literally will go through to the end of your life. A term policy usually ends around age 70. Again, to get more details about insurance policies like this, insurance agents will be very happy to talk with you to explain what kind of products they have. But if you want to come up with a policy that can be a way to transfer your assets or your net worth, the whole life policy is usually the solution that's provided. The term policy is one that's provided just to cover expenses as your children are growing, for if should anything happen. So you may choose to get a life insurance policy. That is optional, but it's something that's usually starting to be offered as your children are born, and it can be put into their name, and that would be something that they would inherit. Probably at the age of 18, they get notified that, hey, there's mom and dad opened this up for you.
Okay, so this is very important information, and not many young couples or parents are thinking about these things. I would like to really emphasize that, especially during COVID, when many people got COVID and they passed away and they left their young kids behind, not only here, but all over the world. I know many examples in India where both the parents passed away and they have these couple of young kids in the family. So what you just described looks like a very important thing to consider. Of course, when you have a young baby, you're only thinking about diapers and feeding and late nights and not thinking about choosing a guardian or will and trust. But that is such an important point that you make. Same thing, when kids are growing up, we are so busy with our lives and raising them that we don't have time to think about these legal issues or the legal repercussions. So you talk about when they're teenagers, like between the age of 13 to 18, because I remember when our kids turned 13, we got a letter from the doctors saying, now your child is 13, so every time we have an appointment, they are asked, is it okay if your mom or dad is in the room, or whether they want to talk to the healthcare provider alone? And that's how it works here. So can you talk a little bit about those teenage years and what are some of the things we parents need to know?
So in that conversation about 13 and up, our children are being given more rights to speak for themselves. Again, that's where that's an individual conversation. So having those conversations with your children, going, okay, is this something, maybe do you want me in this appointment? So it doesn't have to come from the doctor first, but one time frame. So that becomes kind of like a transition period between 13 and 18. But at 18, many times we are considered physically adults. So I think it oftentimes becomes a surprise when you make the appointment for the 18-year-old and it's like, yeah, no, mom, you're not involved in this, or dad, you're not involved in this conversation at all. So and that can be a shock, because even with making the appointments, you could do that. But when they go there, it's the parents are definitely not included in any decision making about what type of treatment that they get, or even how to pay the bill. Now, I say this with the caveat that they are still under your health insurance. So you still will have some information coming to you if you still carry their health insurance, which then that relates until you're to the age of 26. So that's where I make that connection between 18 and 26. This is also, and I specifically reference healthcare directives on here, because even though your children are in the doctor's appointment alone, or they can go to the hospital alone, and they don't have to have you sign off or provide payment, they can pay for their services themselves. This is when having someone identified to speak for them. So if they're ever in a situation where they cannot speak for themselves, this is really important. An example, and I don't have my driver's license with me, but on my driver's license, it does have some really small type on there, and it says, I have a healthcare directive. So if I'm ever in a car accident, the first responders will know immediately that there is a healthcare directive. So someone else could speak for me if I can't speak for myself. It's a really handy piece of information to share with those that are providing care for your loved ones when they're in a difficult situation.
Yeah. And so when you talk about healthcare directives, bills, or trusts, what would you advise? Is it something that people, especially like people who are listening to us today, can they just do it easily on their own? Is there just a form they can fill out, or do they need to go to an attorney, a lawyer? How does that work?
So a healthcare directive, and I believe it's also called an advanced directive, is where you can, and these are found online, you can download a directive, but be very careful about which directive you download. And I'm just going to speak specifically about healthcare directives here for a moment. The healthcare directive, there's multiple kinds. There's some that are called POLST, P-O-L-S-T, which is a physician-ordered treatment for life-sustaining treatment, physician-ordered life-sustaining treatment. And that would be if you're in, you're already under care. Let's say you've been diagnosed with a terminal illness. You may say, my doctor can make the decision for me on the treatment course that they think I should have. But for the average healthy family members, the healthcare directive is actually broken up into two parts. And at least in Minnesota, if you're in another state, you would have to identify what your state offers. And that's a really important thing to consider, is every state has their own. Now, most states will honor a document from another state. So if you have one written in Minnesota and you're spending a lot of time in, let's say, Boston, it's important to know this because in Boston, they have a unique law that says that spouses have to have a have to be listed in their healthcare directive to speak for them. In Minnesota, it's assumed that a spouse can speak for you if you don't have one. So knowing that there could be two different documents if you're in two different states is really, it's one of those little unknown things that can really impact your situation in a really difficult time. But back to the Minnesota directive, it's broken into two parts. The first one authorizes someone to speak for you, and I believe we can have up to 3 people or 4 people authorized. So you can identify who can speak for you and what can they make decisions about. So you can put some parameters on that decision making. The second part is where you get into the details of resuscitation, do not DNR, I think it's called do not resuscitate, food and water. Do you want to have that or do you want it withheld? Do you want, euthanasia is not an option in our state, but is there certain expectations that you have about that decision making? Are there certain drugs or treatments that you do or do not want? You can get into those details. Now, a fascinating thing about healthcare directives, and I actually learned this from one of the attorneys that's on the probate governance board. And they said that when you assign someone to speak for you, they now have authority to make all decisions on your behalf. You can just leave it at that and then have a private conversation with that person going, these are the things that I do or do not want to have, and they don't need to be written down. If it is written down, it has to be followed, unless it's like the doctor's like, absolutely not, we can't do that, it's against the law, I could lose my license, in which case then they would override that, but we don't want to put them in that situation. So just, I'm not saying, again, I can't give out legal advice, but this is what I heard him say. So I'm passing on what I think I heard, is that if you assign someone, then the purpose of that is to give them the authority to speak for you as if you were them. And then when you get the ability to speak for yourself again, then that right comes back to you. So I believe the doctor would have to give you what's called I always get incapacity. So there's a term called capacity and a term called competency. So capacity is the ability to make decisions for yourself. Competency is, do you have the ability to know who you are? It's a legal term. First one's a medical term. The second one's a legal term. And we can get into this later when we talk about end of life and the second half, especially with memory issues. Do you know who you are? Can you answer questions for yourself? Or is that not a possibility? And that's where there can be some conversation there, but we'll table that for now.
So, no, this what you just described. So first of all, I want to again bring our audience back to the fact that we are talking about young families here. We are talking about young people who need to have a healthcare directive in place. So in case there's a need, doctor knows what to do. And so one thing that I would like you to address is once you do that, you need to communicate that you have this healthcare directive with your near and dear ones, or have it safely placed, make copies and give them to these people who will be involved. And also, isn't it that we have to keep on updating it every few years?
No, that'd be great. So actually, even better than handing it to that person is make sure it gets put into your medical record.
Okay.
I mean, really, the people who really need to know this is the doctor, because maybe the doctor, your primary care physician, is not the doctor you're seeing in the emergency room. Mm-hmm. So if it's in your medical record, then they know immediately at the time. So the second comment, which...
Like I have heard that every like maybe 10 years or so, you need to update it. Like, for example, I'll give you my example. Like okay. I had said that, you know, my mom and dad were on my list of people who would take decisions for me. My dad passed away. So now I need to, you know, change that and put somebody else's name, right? After my spouse, I had put my parents' name. So this is just an example.
Right. It's not a hard and fast rule, but yes, anytime there's a major change, I would say, in either life stage or family situations, it's wise to update it. Yeah, because it's hard to have someone assign, and if they're either not in a position or able to speak for you, keeping it updated, because that is, it becomes that's who they would talk to at that time.
Yeah. So since we are talking about young families, can you also talk a little bit about, because as immigrants, or even if we are living here for like last 20 years, we might not be familiar with all the things. So we hear about these instances where, you know, the parents pass away and the kids, normally back home in India, their custody would go to the family members. But here, government becomes in charge of the kids, right? So can you talk a little bit about that process?
So, you know, the government becomes part of in charge of the kids. If what it means is that they have to go through probate, and the courts has to decide who would have guardianship. Mm-hmm. So it's not like they're sent into like a you know, orphanage or anything. Maybe to foster care for a few days if that becomes a, you know, a problem. That whole idea of it has to go to the court, and the court decides. The court has and it's part of Minnesota statute, it's called intestate, mm-hmm. which means there's an order to who makes decisions. And likewise, if you pass away, that's an order of who inherits first. And so I kind of do this is where my hands come up. I'm going, okay, it goes from you to parents. No, from you to spouse to, this is where, okay, I probably shouldn't be speaking on this. If you're young, it's to parents first, because obviously you don't have children. No, actually it goes from you to spouse to children to parents to extended family. Children, yeah.
Yeah. So
I feel like I'm speaking in the Macarena.
Yeah, this is something that we need to know about. And also another piece is, you know, in our community, it's a very taboo topic to talk about these things. Like even when you have aging parents and you are a middle-aged person, and if you start talking, you will first of all not talk to your parent yourself about wills or, you know, healthcare directives, and there's a lot of taboos. Like even suggesting that would be like, oh, by saying that you are bringing some bad bad omen to the person. So maybe, and I'm sure you have experienced this in your work. So before we end this particular session, and we would love for you to come back and talk to us more, because we have to talk to you about aging issues, elderly issues, and what are some of the options there. But when we're talking about young families or very healthy individuals who have a hard time talking about these subjects, how do you deal with it, or what would you say?
This is something that happens across the board. Bringing up these conversations is very hard. And oftentimes that's one of the first questions I'm asked is, how do you start the conversation? There isn't one answer that works, but sometimes it's maybe taking up a current situation. One of the things that right now is becoming a hot topic is housing. Are you able to pay for rent? Do we need to be talking about, do we have to find a new housing solution? Or, mom, dad, I just want to make sure that you're okay, that I have you listed for something. Another possibility is, I heard at work that so-and-so has been talking to an attorney. Do you have any recommendations, mom or dad? And kind of bring them in as an advisor of how would we do this, or no, we haven't made plans. Could we then go together and we have this conversation as a family to go speak to an advisor to get that guidance?
Yeah. So yeah, and it's always a difficult thing to talk about, whether it's your own issues, whether it has to do with ill health or finances, end of life, and so on and so forth. So we will keep this conversation going. Thank you so much for all the information that you gave us today. And I would like to say that, for people who are watching this video, if you want more information, you can visit Amy's website. It's ourfamilyencounters.com. And you will find tons of information and resources there. So Amy, we'll see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.